Welcome to Be Well with MS podcast series, where I and expert guests discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life to preserve brain health and quality of life living with MS. I'm Dr. Agnes Trokjane, neurologist, researcher, innovator at Torbay and South Devon NHS Foundation Trust in the UK. So today's guest is MS specialist nurse Ruth Stross. Ruth is a head of nursing at Neurology Academy, an Epsom and St. Helier University Hospital NHS Trust. Ruth is passionate about improving the care of people with a long-term neurological condition and has worked as a specialist nurse in multiple sclerosis, motor neuron disease, Parkinson's and movement disorders. Ruth has seen the emphasis to managing patients with multiple sclerosis change from very basic reactive symptom management to proactive disease-modifying therapies, giving patients hope. Ruth now works with a community neurorehabilitation service as an MS specialist nurse, liaising with over 6 specialist centers to enable patients to be cared for close to home. We first met with Ruth as part of the Rising the Bar initiative. The aim was to reduce the variability of care at MS services and rise the bar to improve access to healthy living clinics in the UK. Ruth often delivers talks on healthy living from a MS nurse perspective. Since I've got to know Ruth, I think she is one of the few great nurses who drives the MS service to improve care and is a great advocate for people with MS to experience life to the fullest. I've never heard Ruth saying no to any opportunities that arise to her and her patients. Her genuine and empathic approach to people is contagious, and she often being interviewed at various different webinars and seminars which I enjoy to attend and listen. I personally think Ruth is a voice of all nurses in the UK. So please welcome to the show, MS Specialist Nurse Ruth Stross.
Thank you so much for that, Agne, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Ruth. So today we're going to discuss bladder function control for brain health and what the quality of life is living with bladder issues and how to preserve brain health. So my first question, Ruth, is I always ask to my guests this question: what does the brain health means to you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And actually, I have to say, working in this role, it's really helped me look at and learn about what is brain health and then apply it to my own, into my own family and, you know, into the workplace. And just to, so I would say personally, I have learnt a huge amount. And for me, this is about holistic care. This is about really looking at quality of life. This is looking at what fits with existing lifestyles. This is really about listening and learning from people that we meet in clinic and not really having such a defined idea of what it is. I think it's really good that we learn and we have ideas. But I think for me, the important thing when I see people is to listen and hear what they're saying and then adjust our conversation so that it's something that's realistic.
So Ruth, I believe so that you practice a lot of wellness and healthy living yourself. How does your day look like when you start your day? You know, what do you do? How do you prepare yourself to go and help the world and get solve their problems? You know, patients that you look after. So how does your day look like when you start the day?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So again, because I feel like I've learned quite a bit in the last few years. My mornings and evenings have changed. I have young children, so they do vary from one day to the next. But what I've really felt has been important is to include the children in what I'm doing so that they learn. And then as they become adults, they can adjust how they behave and what they have in their routine that is, you know, is going to be of benefit to them. And so with what I would say is that when I wake up in the morning, I try and drink lots of water. That's one thing I was really not particularly good at. And that's obviously something of huge importance. So I try and drink at least 2 glasses of water. I have a short meditation. I use the app Calm. I have been using that for many years. It was of great benefit to myself when my daughter was young. And she had some anxieties that we started to use those, and they have daily meditation and sleep stories and things like that. So I do use that in the morning. And then it's a case of making sure that everybody goes to various school and college, and I get to work on time. I tend to have my breakfast a bit later on. I really love having overnight oats. So that's something that I prepare in the evening, and I quite enjoy that routine. And then I have that late morning at work. The kind of evening routine, we have lots of family sports activities, which is great. Obviously, that's very much in keeping with brain health and keeping active, but it's not good for me. So going to watch my family playing sport is good for them, but not so much for my own health. So I've tried to establish some sort of routine for myself. I go swimming regularly. That was my childhood activity, and I used to swim for competitions when I was young, so I've managed to go back to that. And I go with my son, which is lovely, so I have time with him. Often when we're working, we don't have much time with our family, so for me it's important to have time with him. And then I used to row with Molesey Boat Club, so I managed to use the ergo, so the rowing machine at the gym. So I've been able to kind of carry on with my two interests in sport. And then I'm trying to get back to doing some yoga. Pre-pandemic, I used to go to a class, and then I was trying to continue this at home, as we all were virtually. Yoga virtually is more difficult, isn't it? But yeah, so it's a mixture of things. But it's
what a beautiful story, Ruth. Really, really encouraging to follow your example. You know, you're a mother of two, isn't it? And
yes,
you have to look after your family and their priorities and agendas of the day, plus not forgetting yourself, you know, to set up the scenery for the whole of the day, and nourish your body with activities such as mind work and mindfulness and exercises throughout the day, you know, and of course balancing. You know, there are good days and bad days, as our patients could relate to us too. But, you know, of course, giving the priority, being mindful and aware of our body needs, and making sure that you still have time for yourself is the way forward, I guess. So, Ruth, let's dive into more research and science here. You know, we have a lot of problems to solve for people with MS, and in particular, I appreciate that even more exposure you get as a MS specialist nurse, because you need to really listen to all the possible symptoms and go into more detail. Some of the symptoms may be a bit more embarrassing to reveal, but I guess you know, as a nurse, you build up a bit of a more closer relationships with people with MS, and really you become a family member that you can, you know, really focus and help people. So if we look at some statistics talking about the experiences living with the bladder symptoms, so the longer the duration with MS that people live with, after 10 years being a patient who lives with MS, you get 61% patients who report they have problems that they struggle to empty their bladder. And according to the meta-analysis, that's a huge number of patients who suffer with that. And I guess if we look at the anatomy in general, from neurology perspective, there are some neural circuits extending from the cerebral cortex. That's where our bladder control starts. It goes the signals into the bladder to maintain the urinary continence and allow us to open the bladder when it's socially appropriate. And if we have lesions within the brain that is part of the MS pathogenesis, of course this circuit is disrupted, and people with MS develop urge of incontinence and retention. So Ruth, really it's important to know how does that all affect the bladder function? What is the impact on overall patients' quality of life?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And the way that I like to talk about it is through people that I've met. So one particular lady who I remember very distinctly from many years ago, she was 38, she had two toddlers, and she was in a flat. And when I first met her, she had not told anybody that she had any problems with her bladder, and she had apparently had the symptoms for about 3 to 4 years. So they had occurred prior to her having her children. And this had just not been talked about. So one of the main things that impact on a quality of life is this is an invisible symptom that actually people feel quite anxious about discussing, and also they're very concerned about how people will react. They're not really sure that there is any support available. With this particular lady, she'd been using pads. I mean, this is, she was relatively young. She had been working prior to having children, and she had somehow been coping, going out herself to, a supermarket, buying pads, wearing them. She had a partner, this was affecting her relationship with him. And then obviously when she's trying to manage the children, she's tired, sleep deprived, and she's getting up during the night to go to the toilet. So the impact on a person's quality of life is huge. I know there's quite a few studies that look at what is included in quality of life. And, this is all aspects. This is, them in their own home, outside the home going to work, but their engagement with social activities, with family and with friends. And all of this is impacted. And this is across both male and female. With the men that I have seen or have discussed this in clinic, some of them have felt they didn't really have anywhere to go to talk about this. They're quite embarrassed. They're quite concerned about talking with their partner. It really affects their sexual function, or at least even if their sexual function is not directly affected, it affects their mind health. So then it has an indirect effect on their sexual function. And I think that for me, it's identifying the different problems, which can include things like anxiety, that then can lead to depression. If there's any cognitive impairment, it can be quite difficult for the person to talk about it or for us to identify. There is an impact on, we do see that symptoms can be affected. So if someone has a urine infection or any kind of bladder symptoms that are not being managed, then they can end up worsening. So their MS symptoms are worsened because of an infection. But for the person with MS, they can fear that their MS is actually getting worse, but that is often not the case. So when people get in touch with us and mention they have new symptoms, the first thing we do is rule out any infection, because often if that is the case, then that can be treated, and over a few weeks that they feel they improve. And I think other things that are really impacted is there is a fear of travel, and this is to work, to go out in the evening to see family and friends. People become isolated incredibly quickly, as I mentioned with this person from a few years ago. She had become isolated because of not wanting to go out and embarrass herself. Mm. It really disrupts sleep, has a huge impact on fatigue. And as we've already mentioned, the sort of physical intimacy and relationship. And I think that over the last, many years of looking after people, we really need to be talking about this early on. So the effect on a person's quality of life is often happened before they talk to us about their symptoms, before they talk to us about their bladder function having changed.
Absolutely, Ruth. I guess we have clear evidence, emerging evidence in science that bladder dysfunction have a huge impact on quality of life, and that's very obvious. There are lots of studies around this, and you're right. It's an increased rate of the depression and anxiety, diminished mobility, exercise rate and movement because of the bladder issues. A lot of social isolation, physical intimacy, relationships are affected, and that's really clear for us. And I guess, people almost start talking about when it's really affecting their quality of life, but we should cover the topic of bladder problems and issues early on at the beginning of their condition, and perhaps maybe a bit of a counseling, when we meet people, when we diagnose people with MS, we should probably mention that bladder is one of the commonest symptoms living with MS. And there are some other pelvis problems such as erection in male gender. So that's an early symptom, could be one of the first symptoms of MS as well. And there's nothing more embarrassing than just to reveal and get some help, because there is a lot of help that people could get having these bladder issues. And of course, quality of life has got a huge impact on brain health too. When your life is affected by symptoms, so of course your performance drops, your thinking processes are also affected. So over the time, if we are not too careful, if patients are not revealing, if we are not asking questions in our clinics, so we are missing an opportunity to actually help each other and find the solution to resolve the ongoing issues. So yes, and we need to talk about this at early stages of the disease. Living with MS is already a very impactful and very emotionally draining disease, but having symptoms solved, I think that could take at least 1/3 of the burden living with this condition. So Ruth, how frequently do you refer patients to bladder and bowel team? Because we have a separate teams that supports our MS services. And what is the outcome when people go and see specialists at bladder and bowel clinics? And what the other common procedures that people are getting from the visits at the bladder and bowel team?
Yeah, I frequently refer to the bladder and bowel team. It did change during the pandemic, which has been a real shame. The lead bladder and bowel nurse retired, which was obviously likely to be happening, and the service became completely overwhelmed. So where we had a really clear referral process, we knew when patients were seen, we knew the level of experience within the team, and the nurse that retired was very much a neurocontinence nurse. So she had huge experience in looking after patients with long-term neurological conditions regarding their bladder management. So that meant there was obviously an increase in need from our service. So we did upskill. I put together in March 2020, we put together a home urine test kit, which has now been acknowledged and published nationally. And it's the most simple, low cost piece of equipment. So it's, as you would imagine, you would need to test urine alongside a patient information letter and then some instructions for people with MS. And it's such a small thing, but it's had a huge benefit for our service, and I know is now being used across other nursing services across the country. And the main thing is that patients came back to us and said they felt empowered, because when those symptoms that we just discussed occurred, they were just testing at home. Obviously in the pandemic there was a fear of seeing GPs, and but also people felt really valued because they were able to just test at home. They didn't have to get in touch with the GP. They could crack on with their work. They just ping us an email after they've tested their urine to say, I've got these symptoms, I've tested my urine, and it isn't a urine infection, or it is a urine infection, I'm going to contact the GP. And so that was a real that was a real benefit to us, and that we then developed links with the bladder and bowel team. So what I would say is being part of this national consensus group has really helped me to kind of learn a little bit more around what the bladder and bowel team do and the urology teams. And then we've been trying to, so one of the projects that I did with MS Academy going back to 2019 was looking at an overview pathway, and then we've been mapping bladder pathways, and obviously then that's something that's just been published. I would say the commonest procedures is mostly bladder scanning. We don't at the moment have a bladder scan within our clinic, and part of that issue is capacity to actually do that. So we refer patients on. We do have very clear questions. We send out a pre-clinic questionnaire so that if there are any bladder and bowel problems, or as we mentioned, sexual changes in sexual function, etc., it covers all of the symptoms. But what we do is we send that out before people come into clinic, so they complete that and they bring it with them, and they then can highlight which symptom they would like to discuss, which is great because one, it identifies what's a problem to them, and two, it gives me an idea of what's really going on. So that gives us time to then discuss it, and then we make the referral to the bladder and bowel service. So they'll do bladder scanning. And one of the things that I found hugely benefit if patients are retaining is the intermittent self-catheterization. So we will, that training will be done by the bladder and bowel or urology team. And every person that has started on using intermittent self-catheterization at home has come back and said they only wish they'd done it earlier. I've not had anybody say it was a bad idea and they were not happy to be doing it. They feel that it's when they are able to intermittent self-catheterization, it gives them back independence. They feel really confident with what they're with going out in the evening. They're able to go to meetings, they're able to go to the pub, they're able to go to social events. So those are the things I would say are the commonest procedures.
Wonderful. And I guess more sort of invasive procedures, if there is a real problem and self-catheterization is not helping, so people who require permanent catheter, so instead of these days urethral catheter, there is a suprapubical catheter that people getting inserted these days, and it works really well for majority, and it's much higher prevention from having urine tract infections, having a suprapubical catheter in contrast to urethral catheter. So that happens with advanced disease, with advanced problems and issues and retention of the bladder when the bladder is not being emptied. And equally, so many other aspects for bowel management, from peristine devices and managing and fixing the diet and making sure that the fiber is enough in the diet to control the constipation. So many advanced level advice that you could achieve if you report for the first instance to the people with MS, and then that's being highlighted to bladder and bowel team, and there are some questionnaires around that are being sent prior to the appointments. Dig deeper and dive deeper into the issue to identify the underlying problem, that then it could be more focused during the neurological assessment and in particular when you go to see somebody at bladder and bowel team.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, alongside what you're saying, Agni, we obviously signpost to, the MS Trust. One of the places that I find patients have come back and said have been incredibly helpful is the buddy network within Shift MS. And what they will do is match up with someone that's having similar problems. So if you actually having bladder or bowel problems, then you can put this information on the website and they will match up with someone that may have been through something similar. And that's a huge support. And I know that has been well received by both male and female.
Wonderful. So it's having peer-to-peer support is really important because you don't feel like you're on your own. There are so many people affected, it makes you feel much, much better. And this sort of sensitive information becomes less sensitive, and you could actually talk about this because that it's wider spread of this problem in the globe, and it becomes norm to everyone. Healthcare providers to ask the questions, get this information, and for you as a patient to reveal that information. Nothing is embarrassing at all. And I guess, having open discussions about anything in the clinics is the way forward, because there are so many subtle things that could be missed easily unless you tell, and for that, perhaps writing, using some various different digital tools, or writing on a piece of paper in a simple way the issues and problems that are day to day, and discussing that in the clinics, saving time for us, because sometimes people forget when they come and talk to see us. And I guess having some prepped events in your life, such as just simple summary of the symptoms, would save a lot of your time, our time, and we could tackle the problem immediately without waiting and get some expertise from bladder and bowel team. Now, I know that the bladder issues and bowel issues are real, and in particular bladder issues are increasing exponentially, and we know that we have increased admission rate in the UK. Similar problems as a reflection is in the USA as well, and you know, healthcare providers and services spend a lot of money. It costs a lot of billions of pounds and USA dollars to look after people. So Ruth, the bladder issues are real, and that has got a huge impact on our healthcare services. And as we know, that there is an increased number of the admissions related to urosepsis and bladder infections, so or UTI. So do we have any data on this at all? How to sort of prevent this happening? So we covered that with the simple tools that are being sent prior to the clinics to people. Not every service has got that in place, but that's where we need to go and be mindful. Simple screening for UTIs would prevent the admissions, but do we have any data on hospital admissions with urosepsis and UTI at all living with MS?
Yeah, when I did the mapping pathways across Surrey, that was obviously the place that I started, because I think as a nurse and clinician, I think one of the things that we're not always so good at is looking at the data and making sure that we actually use it in our own services. So I wanted to look at the kind of the national picture first of all. So overall estimates indicate there's around over 131,000 people with MS in the United Kingdom, with an incidence of 199 per 100,000. So then that translated into 1 in every 500 people. And I was looking at, and as you say, pretty much everyone will have bladder symptoms after 10 years. And I wanted to put that against the prevalence of MS in my local population.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so before I did that, I looked at the national picture of sort of total of emergency admissions related to bladder were over 30,000. It was nearly 1 in 5 person with MS was admitted as an emergency. And 10% of emergency admissions are due to a UTI. And that gives, this is from pre-COVID. So as I said, 2018 to 2019.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, it was a 9 million total cost for bladder and bowel related admissions, which is huge. And obviously one of the reasons for my post and others is about prevention of hospital admissions. So by employing staff, that's a really quick win to bring down this cost. So I then looked at the Surrey Downs reason for admissions. And again, it was the most common reason for a hospital admission is for a UTI. And this would be the area that would be most easily improved with sufficient capacity from our service. It is quite a stark national picture, and as you know, as you've already mentioned earlier, is of huge cost.
Yeah, it costs a lot of money for the NHS and health systems in the USA. It costs billions of pounds and USA dollars. So it's really important to tackle that issue and to save some money and to preserve the general health for people with MS who suffers with the infectious, such as urinary tract infection. Looking at the other study that I managed to look at, it's coming from France. It's a French study. One of the French group looked at the prevalence of urinary tract infection and also they looked at the sort of death rate from urosepsis, which is quite debilitating and preventative modified cause of death living with MS. So they discussed that and looked at the relapse rate as well and disability, and they found that UTI is not associated with increased risk of relapse or permanent worsening of disability, interestingly enough. But it sort of makes sense. Only febrile UTIs worsen transient disability through the Udhoff's phenomenon, as we know that body temperature rise and people have more symptoms, and it almost resembles the pseudo relapse. We see that a lot, and we get a number of the phone calls about this phenomenon. And also they looked at some immunosuppressive treatments increase the risk of UTIs. So sometimes we use medicine to modify the disease activity, and there is a potency and increased risk of having UTI. So being aware of that. And usually to my understanding, that comes from the B cell depleters that causes hypogammaglobulinemia. So as we all know, the UTIs are very prevalent in MS because of the number of the issues to do with the brain regulation. And general recommendation from the study was to do the general screening of UTIs, and prevention is something that stabilizes the neurogenic bladder in general. So once the bladder is sensitive enough, and on the top of that you get UTI, of course the whole situation is worse, and double whammy, as we call, so it's really becomes really a problematic issue. And if the body temperature rises, so all the MS symptoms flares up, and it may look like it's a relapse, but actually not. So they just raise the awareness that physicians and patients should be aware of the updated recommendations for UTI, and UTIs need to be acknowledged and recognized early in the disease. So
it's interesting, that paper, because obviously, if there isn't a direct link with worsening of physical symptoms, but what I would say from observing patients that are admitted to hospital, it isn't necessarily the worsening in their physical and mental health from having a urine infection isn't necessarily directly linked to the infection, but often it's the fact that they are then admitted to hospital and there is no discharge planning, and they have a catheter put in on admission, and then that there is no pathway for that to be removed. So many times I've gone in to see patients on the ward that I haven't been notified about, and they have been there for weeks. So already they've got deconditioning, which is probably unrelated to their MS, and then trying to get that back. So trying to help that person recover. There isn't the normal, we don't have, automatic inpatient neuro rehab, and services in the community often take weeks to go in. So for me, the worsening can often be related to unrelated MS changes. And that's where I think that we really need to help and support people and to improve the services.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more than that. And Ruth, how do you approach people, when they have recurrent UTIs, and when they have issues with the bladder, retention and incontinence? What methods do you use to approach people and get that information in your clinics? As a MS nurse, you have a huge exposure, and I think it's one of the commonest symptoms, isn't it?
Yeah, for me, it's really about building the relationship with the person. You've already alluded to that. I think it's really important that we see the same people. Sometimes in larger services, it's difficult for that relationship building to occur, but I do feel that if there are identified staff, it's important if people can come in to clinic and build relationships. And even in one clinic appointment, for me, it's back to really listening and letting for the person to feel valued and heard. And I think when someone arrives into clinic, I let them talk. I want to go through their pre-clinic assessment form. I want to listen to what they want to talk about. And then from there, then we go through other, so we may then talk about their bladder. And I just feel then there's more engagement because they've been able to discuss what they feel is important. Because this symptom is invisible, people can avoid talking about it. So, and that's just sort of expertise built up over time. I really want them to feel safe. I want to go through other general questions. So I will often just, create some sort of rapport, talking about their family, how work's going, how they've managed over the last few years, and just encourage other sort of conversations to start with. I do feel that if, things are brought up in clinic, so I don't know about you, Agne, but I've been finding there's a lot of emotions in clinic at the moment. I would say probably 50 to 75% of patients will often cry. There'll be lots of emotions in the clinic, and it's that for me it's good. People are obviously feeling that they're able to kind of really let me know how they are, but also that they've been able to talk about it and for this to come out. So if I feel that some of the more sensitive information around the bladder issues hasn't been talked about, I will set up a phone call to follow, so that we're able to then if there's something else, they're able to to talk further about it. So sometimes things bit top line will be discussed, and if at the end I will say to them, would you like a follow-up call? Would it be helpful for us to go through things in more finite detail, or just go through a few extra things? And then we'll set that for a month, and that's mostly just to give them a bit of time to think about if there's anything else. We also have a single point of access. I think that was part of the new NICE guidance. It's really important for anybody that we see in clinic. They know that they can come straight into our service via an email, or they can phone, but I find more and more people are emailing, and that means they can give us real detail about what they're wanting. So if I feel that someone hasn't discussed something in clinic and they maybe didn't want to discuss it on the phone, they can email, which then gives another avenue for information to pass, for me to respond. We have email consent forms which cover any issues around confidentiality, and so having, I think, different avenues for people to be able to communicate and to approach us has been really important. I think that really shows value to, one, that people do like to discuss things in different ways, but also that the people we're seeing in clinic are working, they have families, they may come to clinic with a whole different, in their head, they're worrying about something that's just happened. So yeah, there's quite a few things that, but essentially it's about building that relationship.
Absolutely. So, and with building the relationship, you connect. People start opening their hearts and minds, and they start sharing the reality as it is, without hiding, without keeping to themselves, because you wouldn't get help if you just kept it, and I guess this sort of a bi-directional discussion that happens in our clinics is something that we learn from each other. It's a sharing experience. It's not just you tell us and we just listen, and it has got a reciprocal and sort of a feedback that comes with our management changes of your health. So I think if you're listening to us, don't hide it. Always reveal that to your MS specialist and nurse and consultant neurologist or any neurologist that you work with. And there's nothing embarrassing here, just to reveal and talk and express your worries. That's the main thing in this life. Now, Ruth, we both were involved in developing consensus of MS bladder pathway, and I would like you to perhaps maybe summarize key messages from this paper and consensus. What should healthcare provider and patients be aware of coming from this consensus group?
Yeah, it was great. It was a group of bladder and bowel nurses. As you say, Agni were involved. There were other neurologists, MS nurses. There were people with MS, patient organisations, and other organisations which are run by people with MS, for people with MS. So that was really important at the beginning, was to have a kind of a multidisciplinary group, but obviously we needed to include the patient experience. And so the background to this project was looking at what was out there, and some of the studies and reports that we particularly looked at. One was the Forgotten Many, which highlighted looking for people with MS that are not known to services. And as part of that, we did a case study in my service, and I thought across Surrey I would be very much aware of people with MS, but actually identified 25% of the prevalence of MS with my local population were not known to us. In another area in Southampton, 50% of their local population were not known to them with MS. So, who was managing bladder and bowel and all the other issues? The other one was the optimal care pathway. There is one nationally, but they did not have any specific detail around bladder management. So it was identified we need to look at particular bladder management that was agreed, but in a national scale. The previous bladder guidance had been put together by Claire Fowler, and that was in 2009. So it was felt that really needed to be updated. The evidence that we used in the document really wanted to be around the sort of proactive management and looking at how we could improve patient outcomes. And also it was because we knew that people that we were looking after were failing to receive appropriate management, and were left thinking that bladder issues were inevitable and untreatable. And I think that case study that I mentioned earlier really demonstrates that. and they felt that they had to live with the problem, which is, as we know, quite clearly not the case. And we really wanted to sort of reconsider the previous guidelines and re-examine the evidence base and look at new developments within the changing NHS landscape, which was changing anyway, and then we hit the pandemic. I think it was really to raise awareness amongst healthcare professionals and amongst people with MS, so they were aware from their side as well what they could access, and obviously we needed to upskill staff. We know that health inequalities exist. We know that we need to look at sort of education for patients, health and healthcare professionals, recognition of early symptoms, so that we really talk about it at diagnosis, and it is often included in the diagnosis course. There's a newly diagnosed course that we run, and I know lots of other centres have run, and we do get a bladder and bowel nurse to come and talk. And I know sometimes people have felt that was a bit frightening, so we've obviously been very, very sensitive to the information that is discussed. But I think for what we know that this is invisible and hidden, people don't talk about it. That was really the kind of where we were coming from. And also incorporating more of a formal bladder assessment into our regular MS review. The NICE guidance, again, looking at the comprehensive review, has included lots more formal assessments, and we really need to look at reducing variance and standardising care. So this was kind of what we were looking at with regard to the background. We all got together and we put together the consensus guidelines, and we wanted to look at how we could improve bladder management, but also from the NHS point, obviously that we need to be able to identify ways to reduce the huge economic burden, and look at reducing the cost of that, emergency admission that we've already discussed. There was an urgent need to ensure bladder assessments were undertaken by competent professionals. So one of the things we looked at was who should be doing these, what training requirements were in place. So looking at competencies, and really looking at joint working between MS, continence and neurology teams. And I think for me, just being a part of this whole journey, I have learned a lot. It's really enabled me to discuss with my local team, to look at the regional teams and what we're offering to prevent duplication of work, which with reduced capacity, as the MS Trust highlighted in their document, nurses and yourself and all of us really are overstretched. So it was really looking at the appropriate skill mix between teams. I would say the updated guidelines look at many sort of facets of managing MS bladder, the need to offer people a really holistic service to improve their quality of life, as well as their neurological outcomes, whilst also, as I said, reducing the unnecessary and preventable admissions to hospital.
Yeah.
They are the gold, ideally they are the gold standard. And just from the consensus document, we've just published the pathways, which we are hoping to then roll out in regional centres, so that information, because one of the things for me is we have to put these things together, but nobody knows about them. So it's really important that this gets out to healthcare professionals and to people with MS.
Wonderful. What a nice summary. Very comprehensive. Ruth, it's really amazing to have that information and knowledge, and it's such a short period of time, long consensus, long paper, but you managed to summarize that very nicely. So thank you for that, Ruth. And I think the way that consensus looks at our work that we do in this life is at the service level, patient level, and very comprehensive, holistic advice to healthcare providers and patients. So I think it's really important to get into detail if it is something that you were worried about and you would like to know a bit better how the services are functioning at the level of the bladder dysfunction. So I think it's important to dive deeper and get to know this consensus by reading it. So I think it's everywhere online on MS Academy webpage and elsewhere. Ruth?
Yes, yeah, or just put into Google bladder dysfunction in MS consensus.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Ruth. So I would like to go into and talk a little bit more provocative questions that I've got in place. So I just want to know a little bit your feelings and insight about general sort of beliefs. What is true from your observation to preserve the brain health? Even though you can't prove it at this stage, we spent about an hour almost talking about the bladder health and how it's linked to our wellness and quality of life, and how it's all connected, and how it's important for us to recognize the issue and tackle and try and solve it. But from your own observation, how to preserve the brain health? What do you think is what's going on here in this world?
No, it's a really interesting question. I think it goes back to what you said at the very beginning. Where I feel that we have changed in our management of MS is we've gone from when I first worked in MS in the early 90s, it was always reactive management. We are now much more proactive, but I think this is a journey. For me, we aren't there. We are on the way, and I feel that we really need to look at, my observation is that we need to look at really proper physical and mind health support, and not just the words. I don't think that we have that package. I'm talking about this from diagnosis. We really need to be a lot more, I don't like to use the word pushy, but I think, if we're building that relationship with patients, we do need to be quite direct when it comes to explaining how important it is that at diagnosis they have support from a dietitian to talk about weight management, what foods would be of benefit, a physio to look at prevention of deconditioning, core strength, the importance of these things, an occupational therapist maybe to help with managing fatigue. I just think that and mind health, we obviously are really struggling with services around that. I see patients that detach quite early. They have difficulties with agreeing that they actually have MS. They don't quite believe the diagnosis, and that time is not given to them. We need to acknowledge and say to them, that's absolutely fine. That is really normal for you to feel like that. I think sometimes that when people are diagnosed, they're expecting to go through this process in a really short period. And actually, when I see patients, I will explain to them this is a journey, and that actually, however long it takes for them to get to come to terms and for them to deal with those, feelings around time of diagnosis, it's right for them. So I think we just need to have much more formal, structured support at diagnosis, and for people to feel that they have that time to have the conversation. I know there's a paper that talks about hope and resilience, improving grit. And that's what I'm talking about, really. I think that if we can allow people more time early on at diagnosis, then we would increase engagement, we would improve the relationship, and ultimately the long-term brain health.
It almost feels like a nice summary and wrap up of our conversation, Ruth. I wouldn't have anything more beautiful to add. I think your patients are so lucky to have you as a MS nurse. You're so innovative, you're open-minded, you always look for opportunities to improve the service, to give access to simple tools to prevent from having diseases, worsening of the disease, prevent from having UTIs, and your healthy lifestyle approach for people, who are struggling, who are lost, who are feeling lost, and who requires a little push, to make these little changes to improve the brain health and overall health, and prevent from developing any comorbidities besides the long-term conditions such as multiple sclerosis. So we have to finish here, Ruth. We could potentially talk non-stop for all day, because we share the interests in general, in our professional lives as well as personal lives, I believe. So we always have a nice chat when we meet each other. And my very final question here is, we have this the structure of these interviews that the guests are asking questions to each other, and you've got a question from Professor Ford. This time we discussed with Professor Ford about the social determinants of health and how it's being monitored and recorded, and what are the issues around in the globe, and we covered consensus around this topic. So her question is, do you ask questions about the social determinants of health in your clinics, and do you record that in the patient's notes or electronic healthcare records? What is your awareness around this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do. We ask quite a few bits and pieces. Again, we use the pre-clinic questionnaire to identify quite a few answers prior to people coming in, so that the time allocated in clinic is for them. We gather information around age, gender, geography. Obviously, we have their address. I ask whether they own or rent a property. Are they working? Who they live with? I ask actually where they work, looking at travel to and from work, how long they've been there. If the person I see isn't working, I ask them what they used to do, and kind of have an idea of their work journey, and are they doing any voluntary work, because that's been shown to be quite important for people if they aren't able to work in paid work. Yeah. And also, do they have a support network? And if so, what does this look like? So for some patients, they're living in an area that they grew up in, which means they have a great support network. For some people, they've moved and they're not anywhere near people that they know. And so it's, how can I support them to have those contacts, to have the links? And the one thing that is good that has happened in the last couple of years is that we do have more support. So we use the OMS circles, the local MS society. There's other groups that are kind of meeting that people can choose whether they see face to face, whether it's virtual, whether it's on the phone. And as I mentioned, that buddy network. So yeah, and the other thing is, obviously, if we go and see people at home, we gather a lot more information, and we can get a greater understanding of what other issues. So if we go in and the place is quite cluttered, and there's obviously a sort of, they're not coping, then we can delve further into other social determinants of health.
Ruth, I've learned a lot of things today, and you gave me so many ideas that we haven't been doing this, and you're already ahead of the game, finding the way, finding the energy, finding your curiosity to explore and to develop new things, such as simple things. Sending the questionnaire to people prior to the clinic is very powerful tool. So thanks for that, Ruth. So Ruth, the very last question, I promise this is really the last question I would like to ask. So can you ask a question to another Be Well with MS podcast guest on brain health? I'm not going to tell you the name of the person that I'm going to interview next, but I would like to hear from you. What would you like to ask on the brain health? Just say, do you record bladder symptoms on your healthcare records?
Okay.
I guess that would be, let me just think a little bit.
I guess from my point of view, it'd be really interesting to hear if we record MS bladder symptoms on the database.
Okay, so yes, I will certainly ask the person that I'm going to interview next this question to see whether we actually record the issues on our healthcare records. Thank you for that, Ruth, and so excited that we had such a nice conversation around such an important topic. It cannot be ignored. And getting to know you better each time, I just want to know, what is the driver behind? What is your quote you live your life by, or you think often, Ruth, these days?
So for me, it's really simple. It is, we just need to look after each other.
Oh, so nice. Thank you so much, Ruth. Thanks for coming. Thanks for attending. Thanks for interview. Thanks for your knowledge and experience that you shared today. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Agni.
Thank you.